Thank you for joining us for this webinar recording on preparing for the berry season with insect disease, weed, and nutrition updates. This webinar recording started about a minute in due to a little bit of a technical difficulty getting the recording started, but you only missed a brief introduction. Thank you.
Question I asked is, do you have a lot of existing weeds coming into renovation? What's the risk of those? First, it's the regrowth of established weeds after renovation. While they may appear dead after mowing and tillage, as we've seen in many cases, they will regrow quite quickly. And the real downside is even with mowing, pulling, and tillage, a well-established near mature weed will produce seed that will cause issues, of course, moving forward. So if you have a lot of existing broadleaf weeds in particular, which tends to be our issue, we're able to control the grasses prior to harvest with things like clethodim. So we tend to focus on broadleaf weeds, and if so, 2,4-D prior to mowing and tillage is a very common option. That's for established plantings only, and it's important to keep in mind there are hundreds of 2,4-D products in the marketplace. This is a generic product that's been around since World War II. So there are a lot out there, but most aren't registered on strawberry. Be sure to check that label. And be careful with the surrounding broadleaf crops and desirable vegetation. 2,4-D is a product that's been known to move off target in a variety of mechanisms, whether it's particle drift at application, volatilization, or the conversion from the liquid form in which it's applied to a gaseous form that can travel a long way, or more commonly what I see is a tank contaminant moving on to another broadleaf crop on a diversified farm. The second question I would ask is, so if we've applied the 2,4-D, we wait a few days, mow the strawberries, and then till them into the desirable row configuration at renovation. The question that next comes up is, do you have broadleaf weeds that survive the 2,4-D, the mowing, and the tillage? And those tend to be perennial broadleaf weeds, most commonly dandelion and Canada thistle that'll survive those renovation strategies. Keeping in mind a 1/4-inch section of Canada thistle root will produce a new plant. So tillage is a wonderful planter at that time. If that's the case, you might consider spur. The active ingredient in that is clopyralid. You may have known it as stinger, but now on the generic market, we also have spur. And it's a spot spray application before strawberry regrowth to these perennial weeds in particular. Only one application is allowed per year, and don't tank mix it with any other pesticides. And I can tell you from personal experience, you have to be willing to accept some crop injury. So spot application to the perennials in particular, trying to avoid any strawberry plants will pay the best dividends. The next question we ask is, what weed species do you expect in the field? And this is where a little bit of planning in the summer renovation can pay dividends in terms of getting weed management until that fall dormant timing. I get the most questions about strawberry weed management between July and November because we don't have very good tools for weed management at that point in time. So we need to make our renovation weed management last as long as we possibly can to try to get to a fairly clean fall dormant application just before mulching. So we go through the common questions. Do you have broadleaves versus grasses? And if so, which of each type? Annuals versus perennials. And then we cross-list that weed spectrum that you might expect in the field, particularly in the late summer going into the winter annuals, with the herbicides you have available. And if you look in the Midwest Spray Guide, there's a nice chart that lists the herbicide options versus the weed species that are commonly found in berries in general. So with that, we can plan a residual herbicide that best matches the weed spectrum. Those residual herbicides, depending on soil type, moisture, and product, you could expect them to provide 5 to 6 weeks of weed control after renovation. The most common examples, just using common trade names here, Prowl H2O, Sinbar, Spartan 4F, and Chateau. Another question you might ask is, are resistant weeds a concern? And the reason for that is resistance has become very common in the modes of action or sites of action that are commonly used in strawberries. There's a great example of an unfortunate situation in Illinois with water hemp, where a population has been identified with resistance to 7 herbicide sites of action, including the PPO inhibitors at Chateau and Spartan, glyphosate or Roundup, and several others. So it's important to know if that's a concern in your area. One little side note here, with Spartan 4F, it's a great tool for strawberry weed management. But in Wisconsin, we have a special local need label for Wisconsin growers only that dictates a very specific way to use Spartan in strawberries. That's because on the general full label that you see on the right-hand side of your screen, the directions were written on that label that don't really give good details of use on strawberries. So Minnesota, it's a bit different situation. In Wisconsin, we have strawberry-specific instructions on our special local need label. So just keep that in mind. That special local need label in Wisconsin is available on the DACAP Special Pesticide Registrations webpage. Keep in mind with these resistant weeds, among those that we're most concerned about would be the pigweed species, in particular, Palmer, amaranth, and water hemp. So make sure you're able to identify the pigweeds that you might have in the field. The reason we're concerned about those, in particular, Palmer amaranth and the water hemps, are that they're traveling around the Midwest. Almost always, greater than 90% of the populations are resistant to several herbicide modes of action. So it's important to be able to identify water hemp in particular that's traveling rapidly around areas where we grow strawberries. This is an example of that from my colleagues in agronomy here at UW-Madison, just showing water hemp populations that have spread across Wisconsin that are resistant to ALS inhibitor herbicides. In this case, the example is imazethapyr or Pursuit, not a product we use in strawberries. On the right-hand side, though, you can also see the resistant populations spreading across Wisconsin that are resistant to glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup. And that's gone from just a few counties a few years ago to almost all counties in Wisconsin at this point. The final piece to think about is thinking comprehensively, and this is where a little bit of planning pays long-term dividends. Think comprehensively. What's your plan for fall dormant herbicides? I often hear people say, well, I'd like to use something like Chateau in the fall, but I've already used my seasonal maximum at renovation. So think about how you're going to piece those together for a comprehensive weed control program. Some herbicides can only be used once per year, and almost all have seasonal maximums. So plan ahead, rotate the herbicide sites of action when possible to reduce the risk of that situation, like the water hemp in Illinois. And even outside of resistance risk, if you use Sinbar every year, you'll select for populations that Sinbar never controlled and shift the weed control spectrum, because we're growing a perennial crop. That's a time frame in which by using the same tools over and over, you'll get more prevalent weed species that were never controlled by that herbicide. Chickweed and white cockle are the two examples most common in strawberries, where we haven't diversified our weed management across the season. So a little bit of thinking ahead as we get into the busy time of harvest here, I think will help you not only have a cleaner fall, but come into next harvest cleaner also. So a question in the chat box about where the notes are and such. Right before this started, I posted this short presentation on this website in a PDF form that you're welcome to download if valuable. And with that, I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any weed management questions? Type them into the chat box. While you do that, we can transition to Christelle.
Okay.
Let's wait just a second, see if anybody any weed questions, since Jed has to leave early today.
And if not, you can always email me.
Yep.
That's great also.
Okay.
Can you see my screen now?
Yep.
And hear me also?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Well, it doesn't look like anybody has weed management questions. So if you have those questions, like Jed said, go ahead and email him. All right. Thank you.
Oops. And can you guys see me? Okay, good. Okay, all right. Well, so I guess I'll get started. I have a lot to cover, so I'm going to set a timer. So you'll hear it beep in 10 minutes, and then we'll see where we're at that point. I was hoping to cover two insects that are the primary insects in Wisconsin, but in the Midwest, I would suspect in berry production. So I'm not specific to strawberry or blueberry or any of those. It's really in general, the main two insects that we have problem with, at least in Wisconsin and I know in other states, are spotted-winged Drosophila and Japanese beetle. So I was going to cover kind of what to prepare for as far as what you can plan for management strategies. So this is our spotted-winged Drosophila that you all know, and hopefully, and I just won't go over that, but we all know that they attack our soft fruits, so that will be all of our primarily raspberry, fall-bearing raspberries, blueberries, but the strawberries are also, and grapes, some that we have to keep in mind, and every year it seems to be more that we have to keep them in mind for strawberry. So what you want to do is at this time of the year, you can wait a little bit into early June, mid-June, but you want to start monitoring for those insects. It's going to be very important to know whether or not you have spotted wing in your crops when your fruit is going to start becoming susceptible. So now is the time where the first one is going to be our strawberries. We want to be monitoring. We want to see if we have spotted wing showing up in our crops. One trap per acre. You want to check them once a week. You want to monitor in the crop, but you might also want to put a trap near the wooded area because they're there. They're very present in high numbers in wooded areas and are likely to be coming from there in the spring. So that would be a good way of knowing ahead of time that they're coming. And this is a very simple recipe on how you can monitor with a yeast and sugar bait in a homemade trap. Another way to sample is if you don't want to do the, the monitoring for the adults, is to monitor the fruit. And so this is what I highlighted at the bottom is really something that I would recommend to do was for strawberries and for grapes, because the strawberry, they are the spotted wings showing up later when the fruit is almost at the end of harvest. So there's not really a need to have those traps. And for grapes, because we have a lot of flies at the time of the grape harvest, but we don't have really high susceptibility. So for those kind of crops, I recommend to really look at the larvae in the fruit. For the raspberries or blueberries, have those traps for monitoring the adults, because you're gonna have adults when you have your crops that are in full harvest. So for monitoring the fruit, you will just do the recipe that is here. You just collect some fruit that looks potentially susceptible or that looks like it's been damaged potentially, or even sound fruit. You put them in a Ziploc bag, you add salt and water. You have 4 cups water, a quarter cup salt. You let that sit for about an hour, you crush the fruit a little bit, and then you look if you have a larvae in there. If you do, that means that not only do you have the flies, but you also have a problem with infestation and you really need to take action. For preparing, as far as like now, what you can do early on when you're preparing is thinking about those cultural control strategies. What we want to do is minimize the buildup of spotted wing in our crops. And so removing wild host, there's a lot, so that's not the best option. But if you have some of those wild hosts nearby, you may want to remove them from your, around your planting. You're going to want to do the harvest every 1 to 2 days. This is a study, I mentioned the name down here, that has shown that if you do that every 1 to 2 days and you harvest, you're going to be able to reduce the population that you're going to have in your in your fruit. You're going to reduce the size of those larvae, and you're going to be able to deal better with this pest. You will still have larvae, so this is as part of an integrated pest management strategy, but you will reduce the impact that you're going to have. And then you want to remove the overripe fruit so that you don't have a buildup of those populations. So overripe or dropped fruit that you have. To dispose of that fruit that's either damaged and still on your vines, or that are dropping on the fruit that are compromised anyways, with or without larvae, you really want to get rid of that fruit. So there has been this study, the same one, that has looked at bagging the fruit, and bagging fruit in a plastic bag, regardless of the color of the plastic, whether it was clear, white, or black, after 32 hours, killed 99% of the flies, the larvae that were inside. No flies emerged. 1 or 4 hours of bagging and solarizing did not reduce at all the emergence of those flies. So even 4 hours did not. So really something to keep in mind. If you plan on doing this strategy for disposing off of the fruit, and by the way, you can also feed them to your chickens if you don't have a lot, but you could put them in a sunny area and cover them with that same kind of plastic and leave them there, cover with soil so that the flies don't come in and out, and that would work. If you want to bury the fruit, I'll show you that in the next slide. There's a study that looked at that, but you do not want to compost the fruit. So you want to bury them, destroy them by solarizing, but do not compost. This is a study where they looked at burying the fruit. So the figure on the left is one where they looked at where are those pupae in the ground when the larvae drop to the ground, where are they? So on the y-axis, you have the mean proportion of pupae, and on the x-axis is the distance from the surface. So the surface is 0, and then you have the different depth in centimeters. And so you can see that they are primarily, and it doesn't matter the type of soil, whether it was sandy or loamy soil, it was between 0 and 1 centimeter. So they are the very top of the layers of soil. They buried just a little bit. Now, when they took those, they actually took apple pomace and they buried that in the soil. And this is the second graph here. It's the mean number of adults on the y-axis, and again, the depth on the x-axis. And you can see here that they had to go to 24 centimeters to see a 97% reduction in the emergence of those adults. And beyond that, of course, it got even better. But anything less than 24 centimeters of bearing that fruit was not really working. And they never reached 0 emergence, even when they went to 48 centimeters down. Some of those adults, as they emerged, were able to climb their way out somehow. From the canopy and water management, that's something that you might want to think about. Pruning plants is something that we've been talking about as a recommendation, but the study that came out recently looking at that did not have very strong results on that. The canopy management did not really make the plants less attractive to spotted wing, but there should still be an improvement in spray coverage. So it's still something that you might want to consider, but it really didn't change the environmental conditions in those blueberry plants that they tested. There's also another study that looked at overhead irrigation versus drip irrigation. They found no difference in the fly emergence from larvae between the two kind of irrigation systems. And the idea is those irrigation systems, again, will change the humidity level that you have, and these flies like humidity and hot temperature. So you might change those environmental conditions. They didn't see a difference in fly emergence from larvae. That was the same between the two irrigation systems, but there was a difference with the pupae. When they had pupae, they had more flies that emerged with the overhead sprinkler than with the drip irrigation. And so this is likely due to the fact that the larvae are inside the fruit and are protected from desiccation, whereas the pupae are more exposed to the lower relative humidity with the drip irrigation. Exclusion netting is one that we talked about, something to consider, primarily for high tunnel, but the mesh size is really important. But all the studies that have looked at that have shown that it was really effective. So something to consider for, especially for blueberry, and great for those that are susceptible. So if we think about then an action threshold for applying an insecticide, as you should all know, we do not have an action threshold because once you trap the first fly in the traps or the first larvae in your fruit, you're already at economic threshold. You already are going to lose some of your crop. So this is our first fly trapped is our threshold, and of course having fruit that's susceptible. If you trap a fly but you don't have any fruit until September, you're not going to start spraying until you have fruit. So then you would want to use your insecticide on a very regular basis. And this is from a study that we conducted, but this shows you on the y-axis the average number of insects trapped, and on the x-axis the timing of the day. And you can see that in blue we have the pollinators, and in red we have spotted wing. And you can see that you have a lot of spotted wing Drosophila from 6 to 9 a.m. with very few pollinators, and again from 6 to 9 p.m. And that's been shown in different cropping systems. You can see that the population of spotted wing kind of goes down in the middle of the day, likely because it gets really hot, and then goes back up in the evening. And so the pollinators, as you can see in the blue bars, are really going, oh, here's my timer, are really going to be active early in the middle of the day. So spraying at those times that I put in those orange rectangles is really going to be the best timing for your insecticide applications. I'm not going through insecticides. I'm sorry. You know that there's a lot in the Midwest Fruit Spray Guide. It has a lot of recommendations. There's efficacy table that can really help you decide what insecticides to spray. And of course, there are some for organic and some for conventional. I'll repeat that Entrust is still the best organic product that's available out there. And with that, I'll just say that, yes, after that, when you bring those berries back, you want to refrigerate those berries. I didn't name the studies here, but there are studies that looked at this. If you are putting them, so if you harvest, like I was saying, every 1 to 2 days, 2 days is really fine. So if you harvest every 2 days and then you put those berries in a refrigerator, then you can kill most of the eggs and the larvae if they stay at 34 degrees and for 72 hours. And it will stop them if they are in from developing if they're in the fridge. So this is really important to do. I will not cover Japanese beetle unless there are questions later on, but that's what I have.
Thank you. I think it's likely there are questions about Japanese beetle, so maybe if there's extra time at the end or if people aren't asking questions, you can get back to that part.
That sounds good. Any question in the chat? Or I guess we can wait anyway, so, okay.
I'm not seeing any in the chat. This is a quiet group. Usually at this point we have quite a few, so if you guys have questions, remember to type those in.
All right, so I guess it's my turn. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so what I have prepared today is a very short presentation with some guidance for nutrient management, and I'm going to exclusively talk about strawberries. I'm happy to answer other questions afterwards about raspberries or blueberries. So, oh, I don't know, it's not working. So these are pictures from last week from our research station at West-Madison. So strawberries were blooming and some fruit is already set. This is last week, and with the warm weather we've gotten this past day, I assume that everything is moving pretty fast. I haven't been out there yet. The raspberries that we have there, they were about, I would say, maybe 8 to 10 inches tall. We got a hit from frost from a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of the foliage was damaged. There's no visible flowers, so there's no damage to any flowers, and I would assume that most of the foliage is going to recover. And in terms of the blueberries, we have several cultivars of blueberries out there in the demonstration garden, and they were in bloom, but that was last week. And again, I would assume that with the warm weather that we're having, this couple of days, everything moved really fast. So let's talk a little bit about nutrient management. There's 4 basic questions that we think about when trying to decide what would be the best plant to fertilize our crops. And the first one would be, how much nutrients should we reapply? When should it be applied? And the third and the fourth is, what source of material is the best one to apply and how you should apply this material. So I'm going to try to focus on the first 2 because I only have 10 minutes. And I'm exclusively going to talk about strawberries, and I'm going to focus on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but happy to answer other questions about micronutrients afterwards. So to decide how much you want to fertilize, or you need to fertilize your crop, the first thing is the tissue analysis. This is probably like the best tool that we have to determine the quantity of nutrients that our crop needs. So for June-bearing cultivars, the best time to take this tissue analysis, that should be done every year, is after renovation, when there's enough new growth, and preferably you want to pick leaves that have been recently fully expanded. So that is the best time for June bearings. For day neutrals or ever bearing cultivars, it will depend on when you planted. So an example is that if you planted them in May, the best time for sampling these new fully expanded leaves would be in July. If you planted in the fall for the following year, then the best time to collect samples for tissue analysis would be the following growing season, again, when you have new growth and fully expanded leaves. This is sort of like an example of a range of what it would be the safe or normal range of nutrients that you would expect on a on strawberries that have been well fertilized, and they are in their sufficient range of different nutrients, and then it will be different for the June bearing and the day neutral, or the ever bearing. They will be closer to the day neutral ranges. So there's a lot of these different charts that you can find online. I got these from Oregon State University. There's one from Cornell. There's several from Michigan. There's several, I think that Minnesota also has one. They're all very similar in terms of this sufficient range. And you can find a lot of these in extension websites from different universities. But the other thing that I thought was interesting to show today, regardless of deciding how much nutrients you want to apply, is to look at how much of these nutrients are actually being removed in the fruit. So this is it's a very general estimation of the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and boron. And there's a combination of all other important nutrients that are being removed from the system when you harvest fruit. So the numbers here are for a ton of fresh fruit. So in June bearing cultivars, for 1 ton of fresh fruit, you remove about 1.93 pounds of actual nitrogen. So if you have an idea of you can calculate at the end of the season how much fruit you picked, you could do a basic calculation of how much nitrogen and all the other nutrients you would have to replenish to bring back the levels to where they were at the beginning of the growing season. So this is another way of sort of estimated how much fertilizer you will need to apply. So talking specifically about nitrogen requirements for strawberry production, as I said, the tissue analysis is probably the most important piece of information that you would need. But also another thing that is crucial is to sort of know a little bit about your soil, and soil organic matter is definitely one of the things that you want to consider when determining how much nitrogen you're going to apply. So organic matter, soils with high organic matter, like say over 6%, probably will need a very low percent of nitrogen, just because there's going to be a lot of mineralization happen as soon as that soil is has enough moisture and it warms up. A lot of nitrogen is going to be start getting released from the breakdown of organic matter. The contrary, if you have soils that are very sandy and low in organic matter, you will probably need higher levels of nitrogen fertilizer, because your soil is not going to be mineralizing a lot of nitrogen. Also, another thing, if you have very sandy soils, is just to break the total amount of nitrogen in multiple applications, so you make sure you're not having any leaching of the fertilizer. So for June-bearing, for established June-bearing plantings, if they're looking weak and or you see cold damage, this is the only time that I will recommend to apply some nitrogen fertilizer in the spring, and just a very general recommendation between 15 to 20 pounds per acre in the spring. And why this is the only time that I would recommend to apply in the spring, because in general we see for June bearing that if we apply a lot of fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer in the spring, all of this goes into more foliage and not necessarily more fruit production and better and bigger fruit. So that's the reason why if you have healthy plants that don't have any damage and they're looking nice and healthy, I would not apply any nitrogen fertilizer in the spring for the June bearing cultivars. Only if, again, if they look weak or they have cold damage. The ideal time to apply nitrogen fertilizer is about 2 weeks after renovation. That is the time when you want to apply this nitrogen. And the reason why you want to do that is because that nitrogen is going to go into the formations of flowers for the following year. That's the time, those 2 weeks after renovation, where flower induction and flower differentiation is happening for the following year. And that's when you want to use a lot of this. You want to put a lot of this nitrogen to support that process. The growth and the fruit production that happens from spring until June, until the end of the harvest for June bearing, all of that is supported by the reserves from last year's fertilizer. That's the reason why research has shown that the best time to apply fertilizer on established plantings of June bearing cultivars is about 2 weeks after the renovation. For established day neutral, and I think this is also applicable for evergreen, you would want to apply every month a little bit of nitrogen because you're constantly producing. And so even though they also rely on reserves from last year, they need more fertilizer and they needed to be applied during the month where you're producing fruit. So anywhere between May and September, depending on the systems, whether you have them cover or whether you have them with tunnels, low tunnels or high tunnels. In the case of organic growers, if you are an organic grower, you might want to apply the fertilizer, the nitrogen fertilizer, a little bit earlier, right after harvest, not 2 weeks after renovation. And the reason why is because a lot of this organic fertilizer needs to be mineralized, so it needs to be broken down by the microorganisms in the soil to be able to release that nitrogen. So it might take a little bit longer than traditional fertilizer. Just a note about foliar nitrogen fertilizer. There's been some good research actually in Minnesota showing that foliar fertilization doesn't do much for strawberry production. So the best way to apply fertilizer is to the soil, to the ground, not with foliar fertilization. Foliar fertilization might be a solution if you have really extreme deficiencies, but it's not the main way that you should be feeding your strawberry plants. So again, I talked a little bit about this, about timing of nitrogen fertilizer for June-bearing cultivars. As I was saying, the new growth and the fruit production is mainly supported by the fertilizer that was applied during renovation the previous year. And the stored nutrients in the fall are the ones that are critical to support the growth and the yield for the following year. That's the reason why you want to apply it after renovation to be able, again, to support this flower bud formation for the following years. In the case of the day neutral, and it's also true for the ever-bearing, the stored nutrients are also critical for the initial push of growth in the spring, but they do need apply fertilizer, especially nitrogen, during the month where fruit is being produced, and you want to apply it every month, just a little doses of nitrogen to support that constant new flower production that is happening on day neutrals and evergreens that does not happen with the June bearing. So very briefly, for phosphorus and potassium requirements, in this case, we tend to base a lot of the recommendations for fertilizer on the soil test. So we talk about foliar analysis, but soil analysis is also really important to determine how much phosphorus and potassium. And the reason why is because we want to put these nutrients as pre-planting amendments. Mostly that's the best way to supply phosphorus and potassium. So these are a table that I collected some data from some publications from the Oregon and Washington, but also from Minnesota Extension. And so these are just summaries of very broad ranges of applications of phosphorus as phosphate and potassium as potash for different range of concentrations in the soil. And one point that I want to make is that for day neutral cultivars, if you're growing day neutral cultivars, the amount of potassium that you're applying needs to be similar to the rate of nitrogen. So if you're using a blend and you're applying nitrogen, you would want the proportion and the percentage of nitrogen and potassium on that blend to be very similar. So you're applying the same amount of those two elements. And the reason why is potassium is one of the elements that is extracted in higher quantity by the fruit. So you need to apply quite a bit of potassium for fruit production in general, and applying it at the same rates as nitrogen has shown the best results for day neutral cultivars. And with that, I will be happy to answer any questions through the chat or wait until the very end after Anne.
All right, that was great. Thank you. The chat box is still pretty quiet. All right, thanks, Amaya. Last few minutes here, I'm going to talk about berry diseases and how it relates to the weather that we've been having. Amaya, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so first, let's look at what the weather's been like the past few days. All right, so this map is showing, oh, my little Zoom box is in the way here. Okay, so this map is showing the accumulated precipitation that we got from May 19th to 26th. And you can see that a lot of parts of Wisconsin and Minnesota got between, a quarter of an inch to maybe an inch and a half of rain over the last week. It really seemed like, at least in the Twin Cities, it really seemed like we got a ton of rain, but really it was just a lot of smaller rain events. So we did accumulate some precipitation. So where does that get us? Well, prior to this week, we were consistently behind the normal precipitation for this time of year. But the rains we've been getting in the last 10 days or so really have brought us up to about average precipitation for the last month. So you can see, a lot of our 2 states are about at normal. Those are the gray areas. Some areas of Minnesota, especially northern and western Minnesota, are still a little bit below average, but southern Minnesota, you can see there is at least an inch over average precipitation for this time of year. So what else? Our days are warming up. I'm just using May 25th as an example. That was a couple of days ago when we started to get some really warm temperatures. So these are the maximum temperature for the 24-hour period ending the morning of the 25th. You can see that a lot of Minnesota and Wisconsin had high temperatures between 75 to 80 degrees. Southern Wisconsin, even 80 to 85. And yeah, a lot of parts didn't really get below 70 degrees. So it stayed pretty warm. And this was immediately following a pretty large rain event for our area because it's been pretty rainy the last couple of days. The nights are not getting as cold at this point either. So this was, again, the 24-hour period ending the morning of the 25th. So just a couple of days ago, a lot of areas did not get below about 60 degrees during the night, which means that fruit diseases really like these conditions. It's moist, it's humid. We're just coming off of a rain event that is not really evaporating very quickly because of the humidity in the air, and then it's warm. So fruit diseases really enjoy this. These are the conditions that they really thrive in. And even though we can't see those diseases causing symptoms on the plants necessarily, because for fruit diseases, a lot of the time they're active early in the season, but we don't see the symptoms yet. We don't see the lesions yet that they're actually causing, but they're there. They're reproducing and they're spreading. They're either spreading by rain, they're spreading by wind, and then they're taking advantage of those humid conditions to reproduce. So what are some of the diseases that we need to be thinking about right now? Well, for strawberries, and you know, for powdery mildew, this would go for other crops as well, but pre-bloom, which depending on your crop and depending on your area, a lot of your strawberries may be in pre-bloom right now. We're thinking about powdery mildew, as well as leaf diseases and anthracnose. And then as we get to early bloom and bloom, then we keep thinking about powdery mildew, leaf diseases, and anthracnose, but we also have to start thinking about those diseases that infect the fruit directly, which are botrytis and leather rot. So I'm not going to go through all of these today. I only have a few minutes, but the goal today is just to give some recommendations of products that you can be using and think about your strategy for controlling these diseases. So I'm just going to zoom in on botrytis and anthracnose right now. So botrytis, you know, really common. A lot of us are used to dealing with this disease. Its ideal conditions are between 65 and 75 degrees with rain at least once since the last time that you sprayed. Ideal conditions meaning that it's going to spread more rapidly in that temperature range and in that humidity range. So it's recommended to apply applications of either a conventional or organic fungicide, which I will get into, at pre-bloom, early bloom, and after fruit set. So those applications are especially critical for managing this disease, even though we can't see the symptoms yet. So it's important to know that as far as the synthetic options that we have for botrytis, there is some resistance developing on topsin and scala in some locations, and pristine and ravol also have a resistance risk. So it's really important to rotate chemistries in order to control not only this disease, but other strawberry diseases as well. So I've listed a few other recommended chemistries that can be used. Captivate, which is Captan plus phenexamide, that one, along with a lot of the other products, it can only be used twice consecutively before you have to rotate to something else. So that's just an example. I found that Penn State has a really good page that lists a recommended spray program for strawberry diseases, for fruit rot specifically, beginning at bloom. And the main goal of that spray program is to give people ideas of how to rotate in order to decrease the risk of developing resistance. There are organic management options for botrytis. So I have listed some of those there with their application intervals. Another thing that you can think about is choosing varieties that are less susceptible to botrytis. So Early Glow, Jewel, and Clancy have been found to be less susceptible. Something like All Star is considered very susceptible. There's nothing that's completely resistant to botrytis. I would recommend avoiding spring nitrogen applications. And for organic fungicides, the recommendation is to apply at pre-bloom and then at early bloom and then 10 days later. So double nickel, for instance, this product is a bacillus and it is a natural defense inducer. And so this is something that must be applied before bloom, because bloom is when botrytis really starts infecting the plants. And so the point of putting something like double nickel on is to act as a natural defense inducer. Same with regalia, using that prior to flowering for botrytis prevention is what's recommended for that product. All right, so anthracnose is the other one I wanted to mention. I've heard from a few growers that they use chemistry that's not as effective on anthracnose earlier in the season because they want to save that chemistry for later in the season when anthracnose is most active. And I understand that, but it's also important to acknowledge that anthracnose can also be active at this point in the season. So it can affect the petioles of the leaves, the leaf blades themselves, and the blossoms, as well as the fruit. It's not just infecting the fruit, although we often see those infections happening. during the harvest period. But this is what it can look like earlier in the season. So it infects the stems, petioles, and blossoms in the spring, and that's why we need to not ignore anthracnose at this point in the season and consider that it might be out there infecting the plants. It can survive on weeds and other ground covers, as well as overwinter debris. And so like a lot of our diseases, it's there and then it's stimulated by our wet, warm conditions. Its ideal conditions are rain and temperatures between 77 and 86 degrees. So when we've been having these wet, warm conditions like we're having right now, this is what anthracnose really likes. So it's recommended to start fungicide applications early. So in early and full bloom, even though the symptoms are not yet visible. What can happen if they infect the blossoms as they're in bloom is that if it infects shortly after pollination, that fruit can be small and hard and misformed. So that's one of the things that we're trying to avoid. There are a number of synthetic fungicides recommended in the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide, specifically on page 111. And I'm going to get into some organic options on the next slide. So there are no totally resistant varieties for anthracnose, but I do know that Chandler and Albion are two examples of varieties that are more susceptible. Here's some of the organic management options for anthracnose. A lot of these are the same products that I mentioned on the slide before for botrytis. So you've got your Serenade products, which is that one of the bacillus species. These are recommended at 7 to 10 day intervals. Serenade Opti has been found to have the best efficacy according to the Cornell Organic Production and IPM Guide for Strawberries, which is a resource that I really recommend growers get and study. Even if you're not an organic grower, it's just good to think about these other products that we could be using. So Serenade Opti recommends starting at or before flowering. Hydrogen peroxide and double nickel both have moderate efficacy. There are several other products that are labeled for this, but there's just not as much data or studies out there about exactly how effective they are. And those include Regalia, Serafel, neem oil, and potassium bicarbonate or Millstop. All right, and then for raspberries, you know, I'm not going to go into too much detail on raspberry fungicide applications. There's just not quite as much constant disease pressure in raspberries than we have with strawberries. But one of the things you want to consider if you're choosing whether to do a fungicide application at this point in the season is, have you been experiencing these diseases in recent years? Spur blight, cane blight, raspberry leaf spot, and septoria leaf spot. So if you have been experiencing these, that would be a reason to try to go out and get a handle on these early in the season. The other question to ask is dormant lime sulfur this year. And if you have, it may be less necessary to do another fungicide application unless you had severe disease incidents in the previous year. Then it becomes more important. It's also important to keep in mind that different diseases infect differently on raspberries. So anthracnose is going to be infecting our green tissues, our new primicanes, leaves, petioles. Cane blight can only get in through wounds. Important to realize, if you're rubbing up twine or the wires, or if there's been pruning going on, then cane blight can get in that way. Spur blight is only going to be coming through the mature leaves for the most part. So they're those larger leaves lower down on the cane. So the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide, again, is a really good resource for figuring out what products to use for raspberry cane diseases. But I've listed 3 organic options here. Your copper sulfate, your actinovate, and oxidate are all organic options for raspberry cane diseases. And some of the synthetic options include, again, Captivate, which is, I mentioned that before, that's Captan plus fenhexamide. And so that is labeled for anthracnose and spur blight on raspberries. Your strobies, such as Abound, Cabrio, and Pristine, are recommended for application at the onset of the disease. And with all of these, again, it's important to reduce our resistance risk by limiting these to 2 sequential applications of the same group or the same family of chemistries, and not overuse the product multiple times. All right, so I've got my contact information here. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, that was just a really quick few tips about some berry diseases. And So I can keep that up for a second. And if you have questions for any of us, go ahead and type those in the chat. Amaya, do you want to go over that question that was asked before about boron?
Sure. I just realized I didn't have my video on before. Sorry.
That's okay.
So there's a question about whether if I would recommend foliar boron, and the answer would be yes if you have a deficiency. And I put there in the chat, if you have a deficiency, you could apply some foliar boron. You could apply a solid bore that has about a 20% of boron, a dose of 2 to 6 pounds of solid bore per acre. You could apply it at early bloom or in late summer for next year.
All right, thanks. And while other questions come in, Amaya, do you know why it's recommended not to apply spring nitrogen on strawberries in terms of disease management?
Because the more nitrogen you have in the spring, the more foliage you're going to have, and that foliage is going to be more tender. It's going to have more water, and the more water that tissue has, the more susceptible it's going to be for diseases. I mean, we know that bacteria and fungi, even though I'm not a pathologist, they propagate through water. They need free water. So the more lush that tissue is, the more susceptible it's going to be for any diseases. And the same is true, and Christelle maybe can talk about that. If you over fertilize with nitrogen, this luxury consumption of nitrogen, it also makes it more attractive for insects.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you think about a Japanese beetle or phylloxera that like the very tender leaves, then that's new growth, all this kind of new growth that you're going to have is going to make it more attractive to a lot of insects.
And another thing that I wanted to mention in terms of disease management, you know, when we think about disease management for berries, we're obviously not just thinking about the products that we're applying. There's a lot of cultural practices that you can think about, such as making sure with raspberries that we are pruning correctly so that you're letting air flow through that canopy and not being tempted to leave too many canes out there. I would say, you know, yeah, luxury consumption of N on raspberries would have that effect too, of creating too large of a canopy. And so you've got a lot of humidity just hanging out in that canopy that can cause diseases. The other thing is floor management. What is our ground cover? And a lot of these diseases, especially anthracnose, they rely on rain droplets splashing up from the ground onto the plants to transport those disease spores. And so if you have something like straw, there's not going to be as much splashing from the ground onto the plants versus with black plastic or landscape fabric. Of course, there's a lot of pros and cons to think about when you're choosing your ground cover, but that's just one thing to consider. Another thing is, do you have a cover crop or do you have a lot of weeds around the patch? And that is something that can maintain disease spores as well. So definitely something to think about there. Tim Holland asked, would you apply before fruit set? But I'm not sure what you're referring to. So if you wanted to clarify that in the chat box.
Can I make a point here, just completely not unrelated, but I just saw something this morning from not a commercial grower, but still somebody that works with a lot of vines, it's in grapes, but that went and applied a fungicide that was not registered on grapes. That was a turf and ornamental version of mancozeb. So I just want to, as people are thinking about their questions, give a big reminder to everybody that you might look at something, say what this grower, I talked to him this morning, did is he saw mancozeb DF was the one for the disease he wanted to treat, went online and found something that was equivalent with the same active ingredient that was also the 25 DF. So he figured it has everything I need. And he applied that last year, luckily, not this summer. But it was actually registered for turf and ornamentals. And so I just want everybody to please, especially if you find the labels online, just do a quick search for the crop. that you're spraying. If it's strawberry, blueberry, raspberry, just do a search for that and make sure it's on that label. Because I think it's something that can happen to the best of us when you're going too fast and you're looking for, there's generics and there's things like that that come on the market that suddenly you're like, oh, there's this spray mix or something like that. Like there's always so much information online that sometimes you find a better option that looks all identical. And we forget the basic step of making sure that the crop that we want to spray is on the label. And the consequences of something like that, luckily this grower is not, the commercial grower is not selling the grapes, but could be devastating. It could lead to lawsuits and all of that. So because it happened today, I figured while people are talking, I'm thinking, I mean, I would just give a reminder on that. And that would, I see something saying, sure, fungicide or insecticide. I don't know what that refers to.
He said, would you apply before fruit set? And I asked him to clarify, and he's saying insecticide and fungicide. Would you apply them before fruit set?
Well, it depends what you're targeting for an insecticide.
Mm-hmm.
So, shh, I'm talking. Sorry, my daughter barged in. It depends on what it is. But before fruit set, there are some things that you might want to consider, like woodworms or things like that that you might want to be looking at early in the season. Or you could have thrips that showed up early on, and so you might be doing it before fruit set. From a fungicide standpoint, I'll let you answer that, Annie, but it depends what you're targeting, obviously.
Yeah, it depends on what you're targeting, and it depends on the product as well. Okay, so as far as what you're targeting, one example is, so powdery mildew, which that infects a lot of our different fruit crops. It infects the leaves. Anthracnose can also affect the leaves, specifically the petioles. And so if it's something that can infect the leaves, then you need to be thinking about that before fruit set. Also, as far as it depends on the product, I mentioned organic products before, and a couple of the products I mentioned were double nickel and regalia, which I was talking about them for strawberries, but they're not just for strawberries. They can be used on other berry crops as well. Those act to actually protect the plant, and in the case of regalia, it helps the immune system of the plant, basically. So it helps its natural defenses against diseases. And so if you're using that to control, let's say, botrytis, gray mold, you want to apply that before the infection is going to set in, so that you can prepare the plant. You can help the plant defend itself before the infection sets in. But there are other products that are meant to control the disease as it is developing, and in that case, you would think about when is the disease actually impacting the plants. So it depends on the disease, depends on the product, and it also depends. Think about the weather and what the weather has been like. Has it been wet? Has it been really warm? Because those are the conditions that a lot of our diseases really like. So it is 2:01. So we're gonna wrap up, but while people are still here, I just wanted to say, along Christelle's point of staying with the label, I was also having a discussion with a grower recently about something that happened, it was several years ago, but they accidentally applied a product that was labeled in Canada for strawberries. He thought it was labeled in our state, but it was not. And the Department of Agriculture can actually come out and do checks on the farm to make sure that you're staying within label. And that actually happened to them. And so there are fines associated with that. So make sure that if you're looking at a product, maybe a product that we mentioned here, even make sure that it's actually labeled in your state. For instance, Dual Magnum, which is an herbicide that was just recently labeled in Minnesota, but it's labeled in a lot of states. And so somebody might think, well, I'm going to apply that. It's actually not, until recently, it wasn't labeled for berry crops. So it's really important to think about that. And also the specific rates. So if you've got different formulations of the same chemical, the same active chemical, you need to still read the label and not assume that you know the rate because you were previously using a different formulation of that product. For instance, with Serenade, which is an organic product, I mentioned 3 different types of Serenade, the Max, the Opti, and the other one, I can't remember what the other one is called, but they all have different recommended rates. So make sure you always read the label and look at the rate. Craig says, we found that they use plastic in their strawberries, planting in the fall and harvesting in the next spring for 8 to 10 weeks. How do they do that? Okay, so how do they plant and harvest strawberries when planting in plastic? I'm wondering if, well, if it were day neutral strawberries, they would typically be planted in the spring and not in the fall. So I am curious what system you might be referencing. Christelle or Amaya, do you know?
I wonder if he's referring to tunnels, low tunnels or high tunnels instead of plastic, like a plastic mulch. I'm not sure if that's the question, but if that's the case, in warmer areas, and I don't know where you saw that, if you use a low tunnel, so you can definitely have production the following year, and under winters are not as severe as ours with the protection of that plastic with low tunnel.
Do you think that's day neutrals that he's talking about if they're harvesting for 8 to 10 weeks?
Probably.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll wrap it up since it's 2:04 and everybody's got to get back out to the field. So thank you for joining us. And if you have further questions, feel free to get in touch with any of us. So the Wisconsin Fruit website is really awesome. They have a newsletter and a lot of really great articles accumulated there. So that's fruit.wisc.edu. We have a blog at U of M Extension as well. That's called the UMN Extension Fruit and Vegetable News. Our articles go out every Thursday during the growing season. So we'll be putting out an issue tomorrow. And then we have a Facebook page as well called UMN Extension Fruit and Vegetable Farming.
And going back to the first question about where the handouts are, they will be posted on both of those websites. So if you go to the fruit.wisc.edu or the other one, the University of Minnesota, on there will be a post saying the webinar is now posted and you can access everything there, the whole webinar with the handouts that are like part of the presentation.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Annie, for hosting this and moderating. And thank you everyone for attending. Have a good summer.